started. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Gwendolyn Mayer, and I'm the archivist at the Hudson Library and Historical Society. And we thank you for joining us this evening as we have yet another wonderful author who will join us and we'll have a wonderful discussion with. Um, for those of you that are interested, you may purchase this book at any time at the Learned Owl. And in the chat notes, there is a connection to the Learned Owl where you can purchase this author's book. We also want to stress that questions can be posted in the question and answer box or in the chat box. So thank you for joining us. And we're really excited to host George Friedman this evening. Welcome, George.
I'm
I'm
delighted
going to
to be
give
here.
a very brief bio and say that he is the director and founder of the Geopolitical Futures, which specializes in geopolitical forecasting. Prior to this, Mr. Friedman was chairman of the global intelligence company Stratfor, which he founded in 1996. Friedman is the author of 6 books. Many of you may know his best-selling book, The Next Decade or The Next 100 Years, which was another book. He currently resides in Austin, near Austin, Texas, where it is very warm, not like Northeast Ohio. So welcome.
Well,
His
thank you.
book is called The Storm Before the Calm. I don't know if you can all see the cover. It was a very interesting read to me, and we're delighted to host you. George, would you like to describe your book in a nutshell for those that haven't read it?
Well, it begins with the idea that the United States is a machine. And like any machine, it cycles. And every 50 years or so, every 80 years or so, we go through a cycle where it looks like we're going to blow apart. We never do. But we're in the middle of the time when it's blowing.
I read your book and I have to say I learned quite a bit. I thought it was very interestingly outlined. And I have many questions. Let's talk about the foundation of empires. I thought it was really interesting that you said empires weren't founded on military or guns or fighting armies, but rather they're founded on funding. Can you develop that idea a little for me?
Well, everything you've just mentioned, you have to pay for. And in most countries, you can't pay for it, even if it's a wealthy country, because people won't give it up or they rebel or something else like that. You have to find some sort of foundation for paying for the things you want. And when you don't do that, and many countries can't do that, you become a victim. Because this is a world filled with wolves. If you're not going to be a wolf, you're going to be eaten by one.
George approaches this cyclical history that he believes that we have through history in and of itself. So he literally starts with the earliest human encounters on North America and comes through our political history. And he spends a little time on the founders, for those of you that have not read the book. I greatly enjoyed that discussion. Specifically, you talked about seals and symbols of what our founders wanted our country to be, and the fact that Benjamin Franklin much preferred a turkey as our national bird as opposed to the eagle. In some would say that seals and symbols are an expression of what we value. So I think my question to you, George, is: do you think that there's a better symbol or a better symbol than the eagle? Do you agree with Ben Franklin?
Well, Ben Franklin said about the eagle that it was a dishonest bird. A dishonest bird in the sense that it would steal from other birds and never put an honest day's work in his life. Whereas the turkey, he said, was a very ambitious and hardworking bird. And while he might get eaten, he did his job. And he wanted the United States, and he was half serious about this, not to have an eagle, which is really a despicable bird, he said, but a turkey, which is hardworking. Now, half of this, I think, was serious. And half of it was he didn't want an eagle because every country has an eagle. I mean, what country doesn't have an eagle for the symbol? and he hated the cliche. And that was his way of saying, let's have a different one. But it really went to a basic view that he had and the founders had, which is our ability to labor, our ability to be honest, our ability to be what we are is what makes the United States what it's going to be. And that any deviation from that threatens it. And the most important thing that he valued about the country was hard work. He felt that would build the republic.
Let's get back to those founders. Did they envision where we are today with the swamp and the great divisiveness that we have in our country?
Well, they certainly expected divisiveness. Uh, they understood that human beings do not agree with each other. And in a healthy country, there is a dispute. But at the same time, they thought they were creating a new order of the ages, Novum Ordum Seclorum. And if you look in your pocket and you still have a dollar bill instead of a credit card, you will see that stamped on our dollar bill. The idea that they were doing something that had never been done before in history, and that was to create a republic, and a republic which relied on the people. And they fully understood that if you were going to rely on the people, you were going to get discord because the public would engage in discord. So their intention was to create a political order, not that silences people, but that welcomes the discord. I think they understood from their own politics that each side would think the other despicable. And we certainly have a political order that has emerged that way. So their question was not to get rid of what couldn't be gotten rid of, but to manage it. And the entire purpose of what they created was this machine. And the purpose of the machine was to create, to contain this tension and to control it. And they did that by creating a federal government that doesn't work very well. The key of that was a government that works well is a threat to liberty. A government that doesn't, that, for example, has a House of Representatives and a Senate, and is 140 people in one and 100 people in the other, and a president that really doesn't have any power unless these other two, and a Supreme Court, this will gridlock constantly. Protecting liberty, but hopefully creating a fundamental peace. And that they designed it as a machine. And they thought of it as a machine, the machinery of government. And machines have certain logics, certain dynamics, and that was how we got here.
So the founders sort of made history by creating the government. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, there was never a government like this. They kept speaking about Rome, but Rome wasn't like this. A republic, if you can keep it. That's what Benjamin Franklin said.
Which sort of begs the question, at least for me, do we make history or does history make us?
Well, I'm not going to grow up to be a basketball player. And I'm probably not going to grow up to be Chinese. So my life is determined by all sorts of external things that limit and shape me. The same for the Republic. We have two oceans on either side to protect us. We have weak countries north and south of us. That makes us a certain kind of country. We have a wealthy center. We have the Mississippi River leading down into the Gulf of Mexico and allowing trade all over the world. It gives us all sorts of opportunities, which if you live in Nigeria, you probably don't have. So does it make us who we are? It limits our possibilities and opens possibilities. It's for us to walk through it.
So these cycles of history that you talk, or these cycles that you talk about in your book, both the social cycles and the economic cycles, they're going to exist, and it's our place to sort of role in these cycles? Do we have any control over them?
Well, of course, we have some control over them, but when you have a cycle, you have a deep economic problem, profound social discord. Uh, the pressure of the previous cycle coming to its end rips people apart. And we have a government that is pretty much paralyzed at the beginning. We have to exchange that. So all of that is built in because when the machine begins not to work, we all have to blame someone and we blame each other. It's a, it's a characteristic of the Republic. So I would say that it is for human beings to work it out. But I put it this way, as Karl Marx of all people said, men make history, but they do not make it as they wish.
So, the symptoms of the passionate discourse and divisiveness that we have in society today, they're really a symptom of the problems, of a symptom of the economic and social cycle we're in.
Sure, and it happens before. So if I go back to the 1965, 70, uh, the 82nd Airborne went into Detroit to put down riots by blacks. There was assassinations of uh, Martin Luther King and of Bobby Kennedy. There was killings at Kent State University. There was a riot at Democratic Convention. Okay, and we wind up with a president who's a criminal, and he leaves office early so that he's not impeached. So when we take a look at that, and I go back other examples, every 50 years we get to this point. Why did we get to that point? Because the great period that Roosevelt had brought into play had stopped working. We were in a situation ultimately where I bought my first house for 18% interest rates. Uh, Unemployment was over 10%. Um, you really were in a situation where the economy wasn't working. And therefore, tension rose because somebody had to be blamed for this. Okay, that's human nature. It doesn't just cause itself. Somebody had to be blamed for this. And in the end, the period ended with the election of Ronald Reagan, who had no idea what he was going to do, but reversed everything and created growth of uh, investment capital that created Microsoft, that created Google. Without that money that his tax policy dictated, wouldn't have had it. Now we're at the end of that period. Now we have a situation of zero interest. You go to the bank, you put your money in, you don't get any interest. If you're a retiree, that's quite a burden on you. You plan to retire on that money. You have a situation where there's not enough things to invest in. There's way too much money in the system, none of it going to the right place, where old industries are collapsing, new ones are not yet emerging, and we're angry. We have to blame someone. So, as you had Richard Nixon and the Democrats fighting it out, where Richard Nixon was the biggest monster we ever had. There had never been such a terrible president, according to Democrats. And he would accuse them of basically being traitors. Okay, now we have Donald Trump, Joe Biden, and they're going at it. This is the way our history is. It's very surprising, but you go back, I can take you back to Andy Jackson. This is the way we work things out. So we don't work things out by sitting down at a table and being friendly and kind. We work it out the same way we founded the country, I should say, with the revolution. We didn't talk it out with the British, we fought.
So, this surplus of investing capital and this tension from economic upheaval and social upheaval, they're kind of disruptors, is what you're sort of telling me. And how does science and nature fit into this disruption? I mean, how do we account for COVID or for tsunamis or their economic impact
Well, of
or
course they have.
societal
Of
impact?
course they have one, but I suspect that for all the emphasis on COVID, when we look at 30 years down the road, back at it, well, it's remember 1920s, the Dust Bowl appeared, a vast impoverishment of the Midwest to the west of you. Okay. At the time, it was seen as the defining event. We barely remember it. Uh, the moment we're in is the one we always obsess over. So COVID has had an effect for a year and a half. There's a vaccine coming. We will, as always, argue over taking a vaccine or not and move on. We are always in a position, technologically as well, of coming to the end of things. Technology is the key of American life because it's a machine and they love machine. We love everything. So there was once Edison who created the possibility to work at night. He made it possible for the Industrial Revolution to work at night. Extraordinary. Ford in the next era, Ford creates the automobile, which allows us as individuals without dependence on anything else to go where we want, as we want, traffic notwithstanding. We're now in the position where we have the microchip. The microchip was invented in 1970. It was first time. It was, by the way, invented by DoD, Department of Defense, that needed it for the F-14. Okay, it's now 50 years later. The little companies that started in the backyard are now giants towering over society. They can shut down a president if they think they want to, and they do. We are, however, it's no longer high tech. Just as the automobile in 1965 was about 50 years old, the microchip is about 50 years old. It'll be useful as the car is, it'll be necessary, but the kind of productivity increases that we experienced over the past 50 years are gone. So it used to be that individual productivity would grow at 3 or 4% a year because of some new gizmo. It's now falling. So productivity growth is not only not there, it's declining. And while we're getting marvelous new things from it, it doesn't have the impact it does. So we're at the end of this cycle in the same way we ended the cycle for electricity. We ended the cycle for the automobile. All of them still here, but they're no longer the driver of society, and the new driver hasn't arrived yet. And that's our problem.
Speaking of new drivers, talk to me about space and the exploration of space and the possibility of other societies beyond our planet. Do you foresee that as a driver? Do you foresee that fueling our growth?
The answer is yes, but not in this cycle. 50 years from now, perhaps, because right now we're still experimenting with it. We're trying to figure out what to do with it, just as we did with electricity when Ben Franklin first, experimented with it. What we're going to do in the next generation is this. The problem is medicine, and it works like this. We are growing older and older. Life expectancy is expanding, but debilitating disease is heavily there. The millennials, as they call themselves, they are reproducing at a much lower rate than previous generations, which means that in the next 20, 30 years, there are going to be more older, much older people compared to the next generation that's coming up. And that's a problem because how do you support all the people with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and everything else? So technology basically emerges to solve a social problem. And the social problem we face in the next generation is the problem of debilitating disease, of old people who cannot care for themselves and who suck up the resources of society. Another thing that COVID did show us is that the medical community is not very good at emergency management, if you will. Uh, they got to it a year and a half, and that's fair enough. Okay. But we're going to have other viruses, and we are averse to death. We are averse to disease. So we used to have things like cholera, and you just died of it, and it was okay. It's no longer okay. So the way we attack disease and the way we attack the diseases of old age has to be transformed. So if you're looking to make money like you made in Amazon, could have made in Amazon, I didn't, but because just we're looking at a forced revolution in medicine. After that comes space.
It's been said that authors write to tell the world what they need to hear. What do we need to hear today?
I think the most important thing is don't overestimate the crisis we're in politically. Right now, we all believe there has never been any moment such as this with people such as this and such an awful period. And the answer is there has been. Every 50 years, Andy Jackson, who had an election stolen from him, Rutherford B. Hayes, who actually stole the election, no question about it. He stole it fair and square. Yeah, from Ohio, isn't he? Roosevelt, FDR. FDR was considered a traitor to that man. Okay. Rutherford B. Hayes was loathed for bringing back the gold standard. He was attacked by William Jennings Bryan and despised. Andrew Jackson had his wife called a prostitute and had in the dirtiest election ever held. So one of the things that Americans have to do is know their history so they can benchmark where they stand. We're in a rough time, no question about it. We hate each other or anybody who disagrees with us. That's normal. That's the way we move forward. So the one thing I'd like to get out is, I've lived through two of these cycles. This is my second, okay? They both were enormously painful, and then they passed. And how many of us really remember that the 82nd Airborne occupied Detroit? They did. It's in all the newspapers. So what I'm saying is that's what I'd like you to take from it.
Talk to me about the role of education and more specifically, the role of the university. One would think that they would be able to educate future generations about this cyclical nature.
Well, the problem of the university is always that it is not just a place to learn, but a social event. It's a place party, which is okay. That's what you do that age. But what happens is that you want to party with people like you. So, for example, Harvard has a questionnaire it sends out to people, interview people, that says, is this someone you'd want to have lunch with? Is this someone you'd like to room with? And it sounds like something from the 1920s. It's he are kind of fellow. So the first problem is that the probability of a woman who wants to set up a movement to oppose abortion from Arkansas is about as likely to get into Harvard as I am to fly. It's become a kind of discriminatory structure. The second thing is it's incredibly inefficient. I was a professor. I taught 6 hours a week, and I did that about half a year. Okay, it was the finest part-time work I could find. Well, at this point, the cost of that has risen dramatically, and the university doesn't absorb it. The federal government does in the form of loans. And so if they have the loans, you can set the price at anything. They get a loan, they pay it to you, and then they struggle to move it. But most important is that universities love diversity, except in ideas. When the ideas become uncomfortable, and this is not new, this is not a new, it goes back, quite a ways. When the ideas become uncomfortable, the university becomes uncomfortable. And so in a society that is driven by um, ideas, right, knowledge, in an idea like that, and in a society like that, you inevitably wind up in a situation where um, a whole bunch of society is locked out. So getting into Harvard, or as we saw in the scandal in California, you have to be a certain kind of person. And we have a huge division in American life. On the one hand, you have what I'll call the technocracy, who zooms on everything and doesn't, is in a position of advantage. And then what I call the declining industrial working class, of which Ohio has seen much of businesses that have failed and have left them high and dry, and their children are not going to get that opportunity to go to the very best schools, the schools where you get networking to go to Goldman Sachs and so on. So we have a huge problem in the university. It's inefficient. It does not focus on careers, because the people it has there will, they'll get a career anyway. And most important, it excludes a huge part of American society.
In Ohio, we have Oberlin, Ohio, which was one of the first schools to accept, it was the first school to accept African Americans. Um, and Ohio is now celebrating its 217th birthday today.
Happy
So I'm going
birthday.
to ask you some interesting questions about Ohio. When one thinks about Ohio's achievements, what we have given the world, and the cycles as they affect Ohio, I have to argue that we gave the world rock and roll in 1952, and thus we have the Rock Hall of Fame in Northeast Ohio, which sort of, in a roundabout way, leads me to culture. And um, talk to me about the importance of culture to our society, and can culture shift or change these cycles?
It emerges from the cycles. Our culture today is deeply embedded in computing, the video game, um, the way the music is delivered via Apple Music and so on. Okay. It permits any sort of music to be heard. And it segments, because when I was growing up, and by the way, Brooklyn was where rock and roll was born. And I don't want to discuss this with you. Where when I was growing up, we all had the same music. Now it's interesting to note that there's all sorts of different sorts of music, and different groups listen to different music. So anybody my age will certainly remember Dion. How could you not? There is no Dion, or there is none for everybody. And it was a universal thing. So I would argue that Ohio did not invent rock and roll. I mean, please, it's New Jersey, maybe, certainly Texas, but not Ohio. And I'll be interested in hearing your justification for this. But the important thing is, there is no, as we grow up, there is no single culture any longer. It's been fragmented, and the computer did that by giving you access to all this. When we were growing up, we had 78 records and little, and we didn't have any other choice. We had that or none. Oddly enough, greater choices sometimes means fragmentation. And now, why do you think Ohio is the home of rock and roll?
There was a gentleman named George Freed, I believe, that lived in Cleveland, Ohio, that was one of the very first to broadcast that type of music. And that's why the Rock Hall of Fame is located in Cleveland, Ohio.
I won't argue with the point, but fair enough.
And I want to talk to you about 2026. It's my understanding that 2026 is technically 250 years since the Declaration of Independence. How do you think the founders would look at us today, and would they recognize the cycle that we are currently in, that's sort of a definitely a challenge economically and socially?
I don't think they anticipated the cycles in such an orderly fashion that is expected. I think they would be expecting more discord over a longer period of time. But they certainly expected discord. I mean, they expected the kind of thing we have. They believed in technology profoundly. They believed that this is the new order of the ages. And what they meant by that was this was going to be, if you will, a time when humanity would conquer nature. So I would think they would not be surprised. I mean, obviously they'd be surprised at all the things that are there, but I don't think they'd be surprised altogether.
Mr. Friedman, it looks like we lost Gwen there for a second,
Okay,
but that's okay. We can, if you want, I can ask you a couple questions till she hops back on.
please.
All right, so we have a question from Bill Jordan. He says, what are the implications of your points for the future of democracy?
Well, the democracy that we will have in the future is the same as we had in the past: disorderly, filled with discord, filled with tension and triumph. I mean, when we go back to the 1960s and 70s, it looked pretty much like us now. When we go back to the Great Depression, I mean, what can we say? We go back to the Civil War, 650,000 dead. When we go back to Andrew Jackson's settlement of the West and the treacherous elections that were held. So my point is that there's an orderliness to the discord. We will now enter a period, we are in that period of discord, and then there'll come the calm. So the chaos of the 1960s and 70s led to one of the most prosperous periods in American history, the dot-com boom. Okay, the Great Depression, and of course World War II on top of it, led to a time of incredible peace and prosperity, the 1950s and 60s. So it goes back and forth. So I think what the future of democracy in the United States is pretty much what it is in the past. We will cycle between tension and triumph. And when we're in tension, we will all believe the country is about to collapse.
What would you say about future conflicts with countries like Syria, China, Russia?
Well, we have to begin by geography. The United States is the only country in the world on a continent where it faces no threat militarily. You look at Eurasia, all of them are threatened. Africa, even Latin America. We have Canada to the north, Mexico to the south. They're not going to take us on. We also have two oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, that we control. So that when wars come, they don't come here, we go there. Right now, the tension is along the eastern coast of China, not along the western coast of the United States. So geography gave us an enormous advantage. And so did Thomas Jefferson, who did the Louisiana Purchase and saw what was possible if we held a Midwest, Ohio, and shipped food to Britain. And so where will we be in conflict? The United States is somehow always in conflict, and frequently in unimportant conflicts, in the sense that if we lose it, we go on. Vietnam was an example of that. the Iraq wars, which didn't wind up in victory. Okay. And then, of course, when there is a major war like World War II and Japan, the ability of the United States to mount enormous resources because it owns the entire continent and doesn't have to leave any forces behind to protect it, well, that's an enormous advantage. It's possible that we'll have a war with China. I don't think so. I don't think the Chinese are up to it. I think there's a lot of talk about it. But the point is, when you look at our geography, we have benefits of enormous value, and they were given to us by our founders, because Washington also wrote in his farewell address, the essential need to take the West. And because we took the West, we have the continent. So I would say we will certainly have wars, but not wars where our very existence depends on it.
What are your thoughts about artificial intelligence?
Well, I had the, I'll call it misfortune, to get involved in artificial intelligence in 1989. I was designing war games for our side, and we had to build maps. And for insane reasons, the hardest thing to do in a war game is design a map that a computer can read. And we spent all sorts of time doing this, and we decided, let's get artificial intelligence to do it. And we used Lisp, language is still doing. And here was the problem. It was an expert system where this expert had to lay out exactly how he thought. And the experts couldn't do it. The experts could not explain how they thought, because thinking is very complex, and so it wasn't there. And so we never got the expert system to feed into the program. Artificial intelligence, anything artificial, is an analog of something real. You cannot build an analog of something you don't understand. We do not understand how we think. Now, we'll get a lot very powerful programs. We are going to get amazing programs, okay? But artificial intelligence, the ability to distinguish between complex extractions. I mean, we don't know how we do it, so we can't program the system. So artificial intelligence, to my mind, is basically a marketing term, because a lot of stuff they call artificial intelligence is not artificial intelligence. It's just a really good program. So I don't see how, now this may be the bitterness of having worked on this for a year and almost lost my career on it, but it's a heartbreaker.
We really haven't touched on global warming and how the potential environmental changes, if you accept that it's changing, have an effect upon us as a human race. What do you have to think about that?
Well, the problem is modeling global warming. I don't deny that it's happening. I don't say it's not. I'm just saying that the models that are there aren't very good. And they aren't very good because how do you measure the Earth's temperature? At what points do you go to measure them? It's very different in Texas this year than it is in Ohio. So what do you mean by global temperature rising? You can measure carbon in the atmosphere and make certain assumptions of how it'll behave, but we really don't know very much about the amount of carbons in the atmosphere and so on. In other words, since I do modeling, okay, the models of global warming are not because anybody's lying or inventing anything, they're just uncertain because of so many variables. Now, logic tells us that you pour more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, you should be warming, okay? The problem is that a whole bunch of the Earth, areas of the Earth don't warm now. Now the answer is, well, it'll vary, but there's not a consistency or anything else. So my approach to global warming is to understand those parts of the Earth that aren't behaving as it should by the theory. I'm not at all convinced that it's not true. I am very much of the opinion that there's such a thing as global warming. I just don't think that the science has advanced to the point to any level of precision, which is not something you say in public.
Ryan feels like tradition and rituals are getting beat up. And are we too quick to rush into these new, wonderful, innovative thoughts? And, um, you know, what about tradition and rituals? Do they count for anything? And don't they have their place as well?
Absolutely. People were appalled at the automobile replacing the horse. I mean, the rite of passage was learning to ride a horse. Um, when we look at history, our history is a constant replacement of tradition. Okay, um, we transform the meaning of the meaning of transportation with the Erie Canal that you guys experienced, and that was a violation of tradition. This country was born as a violation of tradition. It was a revolt against the king. It had a vision of how to govern itself that was never existed in the world. It was arrogant in speaking of a new order of the ages that was going to be built. So the problem that we have is, as much as we love our traditions, our technology, our politics, our place in the world are moving so rapidly that they get outmoded. There are many things that I miss. I absolutely miss good rock and roll. All right. And I think it is a violation of everything. I cannot stand music. I never even thought I'd reached the point of say, did these kids play? Yeah. But I'm at that point. So, how do we transform the Republic? How do we transform the world and keep our traditions going? This is the tragedy of the United States. Other countries have traditions they've held on to for a long time. The Americans you know, change these things like they change their shirts.
I do have a solution for you. Um, we do have a museum about rock and roll here. You might wait to come and visit it.
I would
Um,
like to come visit it, didn't know it was there. But it really is a problem. It's a museum piece, and traditions are supposed to be living things. And we are ruthless with the past. There's no mercy.
I I do have a question from Carol. She wants to know about the periods of calm. When was the most recent one? Do we have them anymore? Is there a calm moment in history for any of us?
Sure. It was between 1980 and 2010. I guess it started to break down with the 2008 crisis, so we'll put it there. And it was a place where wealth just blossomed. The microchip made all sorts of things possible that hadn't been possible before. People got wealthy. There was a cost for it because it was cost us the industrial base, but it was replaced by other things. So we had a very calm period. We had another calm period between about 1880 and 1910. I'm sorry, 1920. It was a period of the Industrial Revolution. During that time, the US went from a minor country to producing half the world's industrial products. Between 1870 and 1900, the US went from being a non producer to producing half the product of the world. So, sure, we've had it and we'll have it again. But in between the two were the Great Depression, the craziness of the 1960s and 70s. There's a dispersal. So, this too shall pass. It's our misfortune to live through it.
Um, Talk to me about uh, conspiracy theorists and QAnon and the possibility of an authoritarian regime. Do you discount all of these, or are they part of the normal system of things?
First, there are conspiracies. Anytime three people get together and do something they don't want anybody else to find out, it's a conspiracy. There are conspiracies in the United States. Now, are there conspiracies so vast that they could overthrow the country? No, because the country's too chaotic. You're not like Argentina, where you go to Buenos Aires, everything is there, you roll the tanks in and you take it over. Okay? Where you take, how do you take control of this country? You can't even give them vaccines. I mean, this is a disorderly country, and you can't stage a coup in the United States. You can't even be authoritarian because people will ignore you. The army is not there to impose your will. So all these fears, if you notice, kind of dissolve. Okay, the idea that Richard Nixon, by stealing the secrets of the Democratic Party, could impose his will on the country, okay, fell apart when it was Richard Nixon. So there's an interesting thing about coup d'etats or authoritarian and stuff like that. You have to have a center of gravity to take over. You can't take over Ohio, and you're certainly not going to take over Texas. I'll say that proudly. You can't. How do you take over this country?
So you prognosticate a great deal about our future based upon your studies and your education and what you see. What surprises you?
Well, COVID surprised me. COVID surprised me because of the response. We had measles, and it was a terrible disease, and we had polio. When I was growing up, there was polio. And if you got polio, that really ruined your life. We still went to school, lived our lives, and it was a risk that we were prepared to take. We had to take it. What interested me about COVID was that while it had terrible outcomes, it was the first time we went to the extreme of shutting down vast areas of society in order to stop it. Now, we've had diphtheria in our past, whooping cough, all sorts of disease, which we accepted the risk. What surprised me the most about this was the almost universal acceptance of the idea that society had to be shut down in great measure to fight it. That's a change. I don't understand it entirely because I haven't seen it play out. Okay, but the extreme panic over this disease, the relative calm over polio or measles or other diseases, it was interesting. They used to have chickenpox parties. Chickenpox is a nasty disease, cause you a lot of problems. I remember when I was little, when one kid got chickenpox or measles, all the other kids went to their house. The parents took them there so they get the disease, get over with it. That would be unthinkable today. So that's a surprise to me.
In this time of divisiveness and a multitude of opinions, and some would say too much press and too much media, is there one place that you really recommend for us to go to get good information?
Oh, don't set that up for me, please.
Well, I was kind of hoping.
Futures.com, yes. Um, Information can be gotten, but the most important thing is that information without a critical ability on the reader's part to say, that's bull. And one of the problems that we've had in our education, I think, is a tendency to tell students what to think instead of teaching them how to think. Global warming is a case in point. Very good argument for it, probably right, okay? It is given as received truth in class, okay? So how do people learn to think when the education doesn't force them to think, force them to find the counter argument? And that's something that I think the school system is going to go through and really have to deal with, which is there are many things that are true and many things that are false. And your job is to teach the students which is which, or at least come up with a good answer.
As a society, we have generally felt that our citizens had a responsibility to participate in that society. And we have responsibilities as individuals. We sort of live by the creed that one person can make a difference. Um, do you still feel that that responsibility is as important today as it was 250 years ago?
It wasn't that important 250 years ago. It's always been said in the United States, but the founders made private life more important than public life. When George Washington left office, he went home to his plantation because that was what's good. And Jefferson did the same. And John Adams went back to being a lawyer after a while. In other words, the founders, one of the things about this country is that public life was always a necessary but onerous responsibility. The really important things that happen at home, happen in your business, happen in your town. And if you remember, and you certainly remember or know of small town America, that was kind of the epitome of it. Nobody really worried that much about things outside. So when we look at the country, we will always find stirring speeches about, how every person should get involved. And they did get involved in their schools, in their churches, in their towns, in their lives. Uh, and that's still the case. And they always argued with each other. I'm Jewish, so we have a saying: in any town with two Jews, there'll be three synagogues. Why? Because they're fighting themselves, each other, and everybody else. So if you've ever, my wife is an Adventist and has been in Adventist churches, we have marvelous fights with each other in public life. And that's where we live.
George, I want to thank you for being involved with us tonight, for answering my questions, for writing this book, for trying to make this understandable to us all. Certainly, The Storm Before the Calm was I enjoyed the read and I learned a great deal. I would recommend it to all of you out there to purchase or read. George has a website with his organization, geopoliticalfutures.com. I would encourage you to participate in and take a look at. And I would welcome you to Northeast Ohio anytime there's not a pandemic, and I would make sure to take you to the Rock Hall of Fame. So please make an effort to come to Northeast Ohio.
Yeah, Buddy
And
Holly stuff?
they do. They do.
Ah,
Um, so thank you again.
thank
Thank
you.
you for writing this book. And I have to ask you one last question. Certainly, I understand that you're a father. What advice do you have to future generations?
You're on your own, kid.
On that note, we'll say good evening and thank you very much again for taking the time to do this with us.
And thank you for having me.